The dawn came ugly and pale, the kind of winter light that bled slowly into the world as if reluctant to show men what they were about to do. The field rolled white and gray between two armies that had no business loving one another and every reason to hate. Frost made a crust on old snow. Hooves and boots would turn it to slush before noon. A wind from the east combed the plain and rattled the dead stalks of last year's grasses under the snow. Ravens rode that wind, black flecks against a sky the color of iron. Jon Snow sat his horse in silence and counted his breaths so he would not count the men opposite him. Ramsay Bolton's banners were knives of crimson and flayed white, tiny flutters of color, and yet the purest kind of insult to every stone in Winterfell's walls. Jon's gloved hand creaked against the leather of his reins. He could feel ghosts somewhere behind the lines, pacing, a pale shadow worried by smells and noises he did not understand. The dire wolf had hated these fields since the first tent was raised. Wolves knew when a place remembered death, and this ground did. He had a different heavy thing inside him. Sansa's voice from the night before in his tent, low and hard. "You think you know him," she'd said, and it had taken all his calm not to tell her he'd seen all kinds of men die. "You don't. Ramsay doesn't fight honorable battles. He doesn't even fight to win in the way you mean. He fights to feed his name. He will make you angry so you'll do what he wants." He had believed her and hated that he had to. Belief tasted like swallowing ash when the shape of the fight was his to draw. He had lain awake hearing the quiet sounds of his small, scattered army. The wet cough of a northern recruit who should have been mending nets on some cold river. One of Tormund's free folk snoring like a saw through pine. The soft prayers of a mother of two from Molestown who had put on a mail shirt and vowed to carry water and bandages and stab whoever came close. The North had come, at least pieces of it, enough to stand and be counted. Not enough to frighten a man like Ramsay, who'd counted men his whole life and drawn lines through them with a knife. Now, in that flat, rhymed dawn, the lines faced each other. Jon's horse blew steam. He could feel the eyes on him, old and young, frightened and furious. He could feel Davos Seaworth's calm at his right shoulder like a brace of wood, and the wild heat of Tormund Giantsbane at his left. Farther back, Melisandre stood bareheaded in the cold like a red drop of blood fallen on the snow, watching with that blind faith that made Jon's throat tighten and his scars itch. Somewhere beyond the left wing Sansa was in the lee of a hill with the reserves and the baggage, wearing a fur cloak as white as the breath that blew from the gathered horses. He had wanted her far away, safe behind 100 miles of snow and wood. She had come as far as she could without standing behind him on the line. She'd given him something else, too, which he'd not asked for and could not refuse. She had written a letter 3 nights ago and burned the first copy, then written it again, and a raven had gone south with it under a moon as thin and cruel as a sickle. Across the plain, Ramsay Bolton's flags moved and then were still, as if the man himself had tilted his head at some private joke. The world held its breath. A trumpet sounded from the Bolton side, thin, a knife on stone. Then the boy ran. Even at that distance Jon knew him. There were ways Rickon moved that were like Bran and like Robb. There was something of Arya in the quick angle of his shoulders, but more of his own wilder, younger, not made yet. Jon's sight tunneled through the cold. The distance between the lines was a world, a river, a lifetime, and there was the boy in it, legs pumping high through snow, sprinting, stumbling, arms flailing and catching balance again. Ramsay rode behind at an easy walk with a bow, the reins of his horse loose in one hand. He'd loosed a hound as well. The dog bounded beside the boy, sniffing, darting, harrying him in little half-lunges that were almost playful. Jon's ribs cinched. He had known Rickon once. He had carried him, snot-nosed and laughing, down Winterfell's halls to steal honeycakes. He had taught him how to throw a pinecone. He had promised himself there would be time to make it right for all the time he had not been there. The arrow loosed. It spun, a dark line through a pale morning. Rickon tripped and the arrow hissed by. Ramsay laughed. Jon saw it in the tilt of his head, in the throw of his shoulders, if not in the sound. Another arrow knocked, another loosed. Jon's men stirred, murmurs running like mice through the frost. Tormund swore in the old tongue. Davos took a breath beside Jon and closed his eyes a moment. "Hold," Jon said. He could not hear his own voice but felt it leave his throat. Rickon ran in a line Ramsay needed him to run, straight and true toward the Stark standards and the Black Wolf of House Stark sown anew by Sansa's hand. Jon's knuckles were iron. "Hold," he said again, and in his mouth the word tasted like blood. The third arrow struck. It took Rickon high in the back, and he slammed forward and did not rise. For a heartbeat he was a red stain on white. A little boy with his face turned to the snow as if he'd fallen asleep in the godswood and not here, not yet. Jon's heart tore, not a metaphor but a physical thing. He felt a ripping, the ends of him pulling away from the patience Sansa had begged out of him. He moved. His horse moved under him. Davos's gloved hand lifted a fraction. Tormund's hand caught the back of Jon's cloak. "Hold," Jon told himself. Sansa's voice lay cold at the base of his skull. "He will make you angry, so you'll do what he wants." Jon's hand loosed the reins and found their leather again. He swallowed the howl that rose into the low gray dome of sky, the old wolf sound, the sound that said, "I am not a man but a thing that bites." He sucked it back down into the ground where it could live and never climb his throat. Ramsay knocked a fourth arrow. Jon, with the slow control of a man stepping off ice he knows is thin, lifted his right arm. The signal rippled down the ranks to the archers waiting in the shelter of the stakes and trenches they had laid out since last dusk. The first Stark volley rose when Ramsay loosed. The fourth arrow touched Rickon and fluttered him like a flag on the wind and then pinned him to the earth. The Stark arrows came down 5 heartbeats later on the space between Rickon and the Bolton line. A wall of ash shafts and iron heads that made a hedge too thick and fast to ride through. Ramsay's horse danced back. Jon's men did not roar. They did not break ranks. Their breaths smoked in the cold and their eyes were wells. Bolton banners shifted with surprised agitation. Ramsay was counting on a man's heart to betray him. It was his favorite arithmetic. Tormund leaned close so only Jon heard. "You're colder than I thought, Crow." Jon did not answer. He had no words to spare. Ramsay tried again. His cavalry edged forward, then halted. His mounted archers loosed high, Bolton infantry, men with pikes cut from winter wood, men with shields marked in the flayed man, started forward in steady ranks. Jon's line crouched behind the sharpened stakes and the earthworks the giant had dragged into place in the night. The Bolton arrows pattered down across open field, a hiss and a thudding as they found snow and the occasional scream where they found men. Jon watched for the breaking point across the way and saw hesitation, a falter, then the smallest gesture on the Bolton center. A hand raised, lowered. Their drummers rolled a beat like distant thunder in a deep winter cave. Davos laughed once under his breath. "He thought you'd come alone with a handful, M-Lord. He didn't think you'd cut a ditch and plant a wood between you and his horseboys." "He thought I'd be him," Jon said. It took a tiny sip of his strength to say it without shaking. They waited. That was the first winning. Not iron, not knife, not numbers. Just waiting while a cold gray hour trudged across the sky. In that hour, a rider came along the hidden track that wound behind Jon's right. A way Sansa had walked as a child to steal apple tarts and watch salmon jump the weir. The rider had 3 small flags tied to his saddle, none of them banners, not yet. It was not the banners that mattered, but the pennants of a house that had not called itself Northern in a lifetime. Deep green and brown, a bronze coin in the corner of one flag. Jon did not turn. He had told himself he would not look at the right horizon for the length of one prayer he did not believe in. He had told himself he would not count on what Sansa had begged for in a letter bound to a raven's leg. But the horses came on the breath of the wind, the kind of organized thunder the Vale was known for, the sound of hooves in perfect steel rhythm. The Bolton right lifted their shields and shifted their pikes in confused angles like the forest in a gust. Peter Baelish kept to the rear because he kept to the rear of everything. Lord Yohn Royce did not. The Vale Knights poured down out of a low rise in a gray-green river, and the light that had grudged the morning caught on their lances. Their horses wore steel on their heads, and the men wore steel on their chests, and their hearts beat in time. They fell upon the Bolton flank like a door slamming. The sound of it rose up, broke apart, and carried on the wind in yells and whistles, in the bright ringing of iron on iron. Ramsay Bolton's center shivered. His left opened like a book. Jon lowered his arm. "No charge," he said, and the order ran, cracked, solidified. "Advance." Not past the markers. Men began to move, slow and steady, shields forward, spears braced, archers stepping and stopping in a practice dance to send black feathers into the confusion. Ramsay pulled back, a thin smile bending his mouth even at a distance where a smile was nothing. He did not know how to lose. Men like him did not memorize loses, only escapes. At his back stood Winterfell. Snow puffed as the first Bolton line fell apart and soldiers ran. Others stood and were surrounded, their pikes tangled and their faces open and astonished like boys at a fair seeing a trick for the first time. Jon kept the line from chasing. He had to lift his hand twice, to catch Tormund's shoulder once and hear the big man's snort of disappointed excitement. "We break them now," Tormund growled. "We break them to their walls," Jon answered. It went like that. The Vale took the flank and the flank took the heart out of the Bolton line. The men of the north who had thrown their lot in with Ramsay, Karstark men in their gray and white, Umbers in their hunter's green, fought well because they were northerners and built that way, but fighting well and fighting wisely are cousins who don't always visit. They could not stand against the crush of steel and the discipline of a line that did not take Ramsay's bait. By noon the plain was a churn of white to pink to brown, and there were places where the smell of blood banked low under the wind like fog. Winterfell's walls loomed closer, their frost-blackened stones with the steam of the hot springs gilding them in thin smoke. Ramsay's gates stood open a bitter slice wider than a man. Under those gates his rearguard fought, then fell back, then slipped inside. Jon could have thrown one at those gates, and part of his body, the old hot part that loved to end a thing, burned to do it. He pictured splinters, the big shoulder of a giant in the crack of wood, the push through, the crush forward. "Hold fast," Davos said beside him, "horse. No good comes of walking into a hole if you can make the other man live in it." Jon blew a breath he didn't know he was holding. He lifted his hand and circled it in the air. Or NS blew on the Stark side. The line stopped. They dressed their ranks as if at practice. This was the second winning of the day, men obeying in the blood smell and the sight of the gates. Ramsay's men tumbled behind their walls and the heavy gates squealed and were shut. For a heartbeat the world went quiet, as if the noise had been scooped from it with a ladle. Then the wounded began to speak again. Then a separate noise rose from behind Winterfell's stone, a noise of insult that had as much fear in it as bravado. Ramsay had a gift for voices. He made his men jeer as if it were prayer. Jon turned his horse slowly. He lifted his visor. His breath spiraled into the air. He looked to the rise where Sansa's white cloak marked her, a small flag of his home. She sat a short horse, not because she hadn't earned a great one, but because winter roads made more sense to short legs. Her face was pale, her mouth a clean, straight line. When she saw him look, she made the smallest gesture, palm down, as if quieting a restless child. "Wait." He nodded as if they were alone in the godswood, and a blackbird chittered in the snow-laden leaves. He dismounted. "Camp them here," he said to Davos and Tormund both. "Within bowshot, but not within sortie. Trenches, stakes, and lines. No one goes north of the old ditch. If a night's fast horse tempts you, tempt yourself with stew instead." Tormund's eyes gleamed. "We stayed too long in the woods up north, Crow. We know how to wrap a camp so tight a hand can't squeeze through. We'll make them wish they'd married the trees." "Good," Jon said, and clapped the big man's arm. "1-1, no closer than the markers," he added, turning to the giant as if talking to a stubborn friend. "They'd knock the armor off you piece by piece, and you'll make them a gate they don't deserve." 1-1 blinked slow and sad, like a winter ox. "Gate," he rumbled. "No gate." "No like gate." "No gate," Jon agreed. "We build a wall and make them choke behind theirs." They went to work. There are fights waged with steel and there are fights waged with shovels. Men cussed and dug. They cut young pines and set them in the snow. the butt ends down and the sharpened points bristling toward Winterfell. They cut a ditch and laid wicker and brush at its bottom to hide its bite under a sugaring of snow. They drove stakes into the earth to make a waist-high snag line for horses that would come too fast in a sudden brave burst. One dragged trunks as thick as a man's body and laid them one by one, a palisade within the larger crescent of the army's lines. The Vale Knights built their camp in tidy lanes. Their squires moved as if their feet were counting. Jon walked it all as if he were walking a problem he could not do in his head. He moved the water carts there, not here. He had the cook fires dug low and banked up with sod so they would smoke less. He sent the injured who could walk to the rear where Sansa had already set a line of tents for them. She was there with her sleeves rolled to her elbows, putting a strip of clean linen into a woman's hands. He stopped just short of her. The distance between them was mostly air and the memory of 1,000 small cruelties, and they were building a bridge out of winter wood and courtesy. "You held," she said before he spoke, her eyes flicking to his and back to the work in her hand. Her voice wavered once and steadied. "You held when he killed our brother." "I held," Jon said. He had not yet let himself think the words "Rickon is dead" because they would build a color in his mind he would not be able to paint over. She wrapped the linen twice around a forearm and knotted it. "You'll say to yourself it was the harder road and feel bad for taking it," she said, voice dry. "I know your mind now. Don't. You walked him all the way home and shut the door for him. This is our house. If he wants to breathe, he can pay for it." Behind them, Davos peered into the late afternoon that was already more shadow than light. "They'll have stores," he said, coming up with a little bow to Sansa that would have looked courtly if not for the blood on his sleeve. "It's Winterfell. Caves in the walls full of salted meat. Root cellars big as a September grain from 3 harvests back. Hot springs to keep bread from freezing in the bakehouse. You don't starve a man out of Winterfell in a week." "I know," Jon said. "We don't have 3 harvests," Davos added, gentle warning. "We've got what we carried and what the Vale hauled and what the wildlings can hunt within a sensible distance without turning into red marks in the snow." Sansa tied off another bandage, stood, and faced the walls that had been her first home and last prison. "We have something they don't," she said. "We have the North outside those stones and inside them. And the North remembers. When night fell, the sky hardened into black glass and the stars hammered into it. Torches burned along Winterfell's battlements like foxfire. Ramsay made a show. He sent a man up on the rampart with a flensing knife and shouted something about old gods that made even his own men flinch. He had torches brought into the kennels so the dogs howled all night. He hung bodies in the yard where they would cast black, jerking shadows through the smoke. He wanted the world to feel what he thought a home should feel like, a mouth with all the teeth showing. The Stark camp answered with quiet. The Vale trumpets did not sound. Jon forbade singing. The free folk made low jokes by the fires and the laughter hid under their breaths. When the men of White Harbor, few, not many, a bear patrol meant to say we haven't forgotten, came up in the first deep of night with a sled of barley flour and the square-shouldered confidence of their own cooks, Sansa kissed each man on both cheeks and sent them to the rear with a sack of onions Davos had hidden like a miser with coin. They baked soup with barley and onion and the faint, warm miracle of bone they'd saved from kettles. The smell drifted through the camp and the men breathed it and ate, and it went into their hands and made them steady. A boy in Karstark gray came at midnight with a ragged strip of white tied to a spear. Davos went out to meet him with Jon and 2 archers. They went slow across the biting snow and stopped where the light from the ramparts fuzzed the world. The boy had wind-chapped cheeks and a stare like a dog ready to bolt. "Lord Karstark says the old laws were made for summers," he said, teeth knocking. "He says he'll talk, but not while you've steel in your hands and 100 archers in the snow." He looked at Jon directly to say the next piece. "He says if you wanted to keep that one's head." He jerked his chin at Winterfell, where the flayed man snapped and cracked in the wind. "You should have kept his bastards out of warm places." Jon didn't answer to insults flung like mud. He kept breathing. "Tell Lord Karstark he can talk to me when he stops proving to other men he isn't afraid of me," he told the boy. Tell him to blink twice and look down at his feet if Ramsay's watching him right now." The boy blinked more than twice and did not look down. "Tell him to count the barrels in his cellars," Jon continued, low and even. "Bread for soldiers, bread for dogs, bread for lordlings who think blood tastes like wine. Tell him to count them again in a week and then send me another boy." The boy swallowed and turned, and in that small turn was a man beginning. "Not in a week," Sansa said later when Jon ducked into the tent where she had spread maps on the carpet like bones from a story. "Every 3 days. Every day if we can spare the ravens. You tap on the door every day and ask, 'Are you still sure? It's a long winter.'" She looked at him a long time, then away. "He has small John Umber with him," she said. "The one who brought Rickon. I would give anything to watch the meat slide off that man's bones." Jon could not tell if it frightened him more or made him love his sister harder that there was no tremor in her voice. It was hard to be a soft thing in a hard world. Sansa had learned to be a hard thing. He didn't know what it had cost or what it would cost still. It snowed the next day and the next. The wind changed and came out of the north like something with teeth. Men huddled behind the palisade and warmed their hands, one to the other, because warmth moved better through flesh than air. The free folk went out in 2s and 4s and came back with elk and with frost-burned cheeks. They scraped hides and cured strips of meat on racks over coals. Vale boys who had never slept in a snow cave learned in a night. Davos counted sacks and set guards over them and sat on a stool like a king on a poor throne with a slate and chalk, marking what went out and what came in and what went to men who had bled more. He had the face of a man adding bits of string to wrap a package too big to send. He did it anyway. At dusk on the 4th day, a horn sounded on Winterfell's wall and a party came out of the Hunter's Gate. A sally. They came in a tight wedge, shields up, meant to break something and run back and laugh. Someone had told them about wildlings. That wildlings are only good at hitting and shouting. Tormund met them with a handful of spears and 2 rows of stakes hidden knee-deep in the snow. The first line went down as if the earth had swallowed them. The second line stopped and had to think about stopping, which is worse than stopping when arrows are falling. Tormund's men had knives and axes and no sense for doing a deed halfway. When it was done, Tormund came back wiping his beard on his sleeve, grinning as if he'd stolen bread. "They don't like surprises," he told Jon. "That one," he jerked his thumb at the wall, "likes them a great deal more when he's the one giving them." "He'll give more," Jon said. He looked up past the torches to the gate of Winterfell, the great oaken mouth now closed and unbreathing. He imagined Ramsay pacing behind it like a kept dog. That night Davos went walking alone. He did this often. He said he thought better with his boots on snow and his bones under the sky. He walked farther than usual. When he returned, his face was the gray of a winter sea, and there was a small, blackened bundle in his hand. He found Jon by the cook fire where 2 girls were stirring barley and scraping the bottom to keep it from catching. Davos held out the charred thing without ceremony. "I found where they burned her," he said, voice airy as if the words weighed too little to be spoken with care. "Where the snows only just melted and the ground's black as a sinner's heart. The little toy horse was half melted down the side, the way tallow runs on a tall candle." Jon knew without asking who. He had not been with Stannis Baratheon when Winterfell chewed him up, but he had heard the stories like men hear storms through a door. The girl had been kind to him at the wall. She had a face of freckles and a mind like a clear pond where you could see all the way to the bottom. "Melisandre," Davos said, and the name made a shape in the air like smoke. "She burned the king's daughter to wake a son out of winter. It didn't work. It woke nothing but crying." Jon looked past Davos to where the red woman stood alone at the edge of firelight. Her hair was the one bright thing that did not belong here. On some nights the truth of her seemed a mirror. You could look and see the thing you wanted to see. On others she was only a woman under furs who had done a terrible thing because her god had sipped madness from her cup. "I'll speak to her," Jon said. "Let me speak to her," Davos answered, which was a surprise because Davos asked for little that wasn't necessary. "Not before we take the castle," Jon said, and hated that he said it. "I need her quiet prayer or her false prayer or her good candle. whatever she is, until we're inside. I can't have a knife fight in snow between my own men. Davos looked at him for a long time, as long as Sansa had earlier, as long as the winter days. And after? He asked. After, Jon said. The word carried his promise, and promises were thick on him like a second shirt. He felt the weight of each one and wondered which would rot first. On the 8th day, the first dead dog washed out of Winterfell's kennels into the little runnel that carried warm water away from the hot springs. The dog was skin and bone and eyes. Tormund pulled it out with his boot, sniffed it, and spat. "He's feeding them the way I'd feed a bad story," he said. "Not enough to make it stop following me." On the 10th day, 3 Bolton men came over the wall on ropes. They dropped into the snow like sacks of coal and stood, dazed, as if the air was strange to them. They asked for mercy as if asking for a crust. Jon gave it because mercy is food too. The men spoke with the voices of those who have known what a roof feels like over the head in winter and find themselves out under the weather again. There were rats in the grain, they said. There had been an accident in the bakehouse. A girl had fallen on a hot stone, and there was no word for after in their mouths that didn't taste like ash. The kennels had less meat. Ramsay walked at night with a torch and laughed at men who were sleeping. He had a way, they said, of laughing that made you want to put your head under your blanket and never lift it. "Good," Sansa said when Jon told her that night. "Rats are enemies that work for us without asking a wage." She drew a letter and wrote by the light of a small lamp. Her hand moved fast and sure. She sent 3 ravens when one would have done, because if one arrived when a man had a piece of bread in his mouth, another might still find him empty. Brienne of Tarth came in the snow 2 days later with Podrick Payne and 3 of the Blackfish's old men. Her horse foamed, and she had that look she wore when she had done too much for too long and would do more if a child asked her nicely. Sansa stood in front of her tent. They clasped forearms and then, breaking, hands with fingers interlocked for a long moment. Brienne's face told more than her words did. "Riverrun has fallen," she said simply. "The Blackfish died fighting, my lady. He refused terms. He refused me." Sansa's mouth opened and closed once, the smallest fish taking a breath, and she nodded. "He was himself all the way to the end," she said. "I loved him for that when I was a child, even when it made dinners uncomfortable." Brienne's eyes slid past Sansa to the pale cut of Lord Baelish's form on the rise by the Vale tents. Snow dusted his shoulders the way it dusts stone. She didn't speak his name. She wasn't required to. "We won't forget the dead of the knights," Sansa told Jon in private, late that night, when the dark pressed close and the air was full of all the breathing in the camp. "But we won't pay it in coin that's our bodies or our hearts." "I won't let him set a price," Jon said, and Sansa said very quietly, "He doesn't set a price. He tells you what you've already paid and makes you think it was your idea." Jon had no answer for that beyond a hard swallow. He slept badly and dreamed he was a boy again, running the walls of Winterfell with Bran and Robb, racing around the tower just to feel the air on his face and the stones under his boots. He woke to snow under his nose and the smell of the soup pot, which had become a god in the camp that men visited and thanked. On the 14th day, they found men inside Winterfell cutting bread with a knife and dividing it into pieces no bigger than fingernails. You could tell by the way the archers along the wall looked down at their hands instead of out at the camp. You could tell by the way the dogs sounded when they howled thin, as if the sound itself had lost weight. Ramsay answered hunger with a trick. In the blue before dawn, he sent out another sally, small and quick and aimed not at men but at the stacks of the barley flour. It would have worked if Davos had not become miserly as a city accountant. His men found the raiders by the sound of a sack torn in the wrong place, and the fight at the provision tents was brief and ugly. A boy from Long Lake died with both hands in a bag of flour, as if it were water he had tried to drink. Jon dug his grave with a spade himself. He did not think of it as penance. It was more useful than thinking and less dangerous than anger. He drove the iron into hard dirt and thought about the earth. He did not stop until the hole was deep enough that the boy's face would not feel the wind. Ramsay tried letters next. He sent one out under a cloth of arms that looked like a courtesy but read like a dare. Jon didn't open it. He passed it to Sansa, and she read it aloud with an expression as cold as moonlight. "He names you bastard 9 times, she said. "He tells me he'll give me a child and skin you and wear your face and use ghost for gloves. He wants us feverish. I am tired of him wanting things." She fed the letter to the lamp flame and watched it curl. The siege settled into its hard rhythm. Days stacked like wood. Men lost track of time because the light did not change enough to mark a day as distinct from another. Jon kept a ledger in his mind of every name and every quarrel, every small thing that might become a large thing later. He spoke to the cooks and to the latrine diggers and to the boy who changed the bedding straw for Ghost. He walked the lines and let men touch him with their eyes and decide they had seen him, and he was a thing like a stone that would not move. He spoke little to Melisandre. She prayed quietly, if it was prayer. Sometimes he found her looking toward the south, as if something there beat like a heart that only she could hear. A fortnight in, the world changed by half a breath. Small John Umber's voice raised in the yard behind the gates, angry and half-drunk with Unger. Men looked at him instead of the bread. A day later, the Umbers and Karstarks clashed in the yard. 2 men died with their mouths still full. A day after that, a kennel boy tried to slip out by the old drain near the smokehouse with his hands full of fat. He was caught and flogged until he could not count the stripes on his back. The men on the wall did not watch the flogging. They stared up at the sky the way some men stare at a woman they love from a distance they will not cross. It was the hounds that broke first. Ramsay had always liked to talk about his dogs, as if they were men whose loyalty was an argument he'd won in debate. Dogs do not understand arguments. They understand meat. On the 20th day, men hear animals before they see them. You could hear the kennel inside Winterfell the way you hear the sea in a shell. Constant, underneath everything. The sound changed. It went up thin and ragged, and then stuttered and fell, and then rose again with a different edge to it that was not asking but accusing. When it grew dark that night, the kennels were lantern bright. It was easy to see from the right place just west of the Godswood Wall. The man who knew the right place was a stable hand who had been a little boy when Robb had ridden out to practice with the lance. The one who had held the bridle and been told to go eat honeycakes because he'd done well. He had never been told not to remember which stones were looser than others. He showed Davos a gap no bigger than a man's chest in the old wall where the mortar had crumbled. "No one's small enough," he whispered, shaking. "Not unless you take a boy, and I won't have it be me." Davos said, "I'm smaller than I look," which was a lie with a grin on it. He set down his gloves, knelt, and wormed his body through where the cold stone pressed his ribs flat. He rose on the other side into old drifted leaves and the breath of the Godswood, a breath that smelled of sap and quiet earth. He stood, and there were the trees, dark and kind, and off to the left the little rough wall where the hot water left its steam. Farther, the kennels, their light and their noise in a tight knot. He did not go to them. He went to the kitchen wall where men smoked at all hours and spoke softly in voices that had lost the habit of laughter. Sometimes in a siege the best you can do is open a door and see who wants to walk out. Davos did not try to be clever. He found the oldest woman near the kitchen door and put bread in her hands. When she shook her head, he put it in her apron pocket. When she shook her head again, he took her hands and closed them around the loaf. "If you say you don't want it, that will be a lie, and I'm an old man who has had enough of listening to lies," he told her, soft and even. He turned and did the same thing to the next person. He did not speak to men with knives on their belts, but to their wives, their sisters, the boys who scrubbed pots. He left a trail of loaves like stepping stones to a stream you have to cross. He came back through the gap with a peeled apple stuck to his sleeve and an onion smell in his hair. "Their bellies will do half our work," he told Jon, running a hand down his beard to keep the grin out of it. "If we keep ours full enough to have strength to carry." The next day, 3 more men came across the snow with hands up. That night, 5 more. The day after, a boy with his hair cut in Bolton fashion climbed over the low outer wall, landed badly, and broke his ankle with a crack like a twig. Tormund carried him to the fire and fed him by hand. The boy cried the way little boys cry when they have held on too long. Ramsay tried to haul his men back to himself with fear. He nailed a deserter to the gate by his palms and left him there until the hands tore. He laughed under the lanterns. The laughter had changed. It had a bit of sand in it. It grated. 3 more days, Sansa told Jon. He cannot help a storm of his own making. He'll ride out. He'll try one last trick in the snow. He did. On the 3rd morning after the deserter found his own feet again without his hands. The gates opened and Ramsay Bolton came out bareheaded, cheeks chapped and bright. His men came with him, 50 hounds in front like a funeral made of animals. The dogs were too lean. Their eyes were the yellow of old charts. Foam stringed their mouths like lace. Ramsay rode with a spear instead of his bow as if a change of instrument were a change of music. He reckoned himself a figure who needed shapes to be seen. He made one now. A spear with a flag, a man with a smile, a pack of dogs that looked at men's faces and saw meat. Jon rode out with Tormund and a line of archers at a walking pace. He had his sword on his back and a long spear in his hand made by a wildling gone to their gods that very morning. He stopped in the middle distance. The Vale Knights held their lines still as if men had carved them. Ramsay's smile, between one heartbeat and another, cracked. "Where is your anger?" he called, voice surprisingly clear. "Did the Red Woman burn that out of you as well?" The dogs strained forward. Ramsay loosed them with a flick of his hand, as if tossing children a toy. Jon did not give his archers a signal, not at first. He let the animals come, and he watched them, something soft and very tired opening in him at the sight of ribs under fur. When they were close enough that he could smell them, he raised his hand and dropped it. The first volley took the first rank of dogs almost all at once. The second volley turned the open mouth of attack into a chaos of yelps and snapping. The third volley never flew. The dogs turned. Hunger made them wise. They swung like a flock of carrion birds from the smell of one kill to the next. They turned toward Winterfell, toward that warm mouth and its fat men. Ramsay had time to understand and no time to like it. He kicked his horse and lifted his spear, and then his men closed ranks tighter. Because men close ranks tighter when something goes wrong. It's a response like the flinch that precedes a blow. The dogs hit the front of the Bolton line and tore at belts and boots and the ungrieved flesh of men who had once fed them scraps. Screams rose, high and shocked. 2 hounds ran for Ramsay himself with tails stiff and heads down. Beasts that had been beaten into loving only their master's flesh. His horse danced and he jabbed with his spear. The point slipped on a skull or a shoulder, and the horse went sideways. A man in Karstark gray lifted his shield, looked at Ramsay with an expression that bade his lord a complicated, bitter farewell, and stepped away to let the dogs flow past. Jon nudged his horse forward at a walk. He could have shouted something, he didn't. He let the math of hunger and cruelty come to its sum. Ramsay made a sound, and for the first time it was not laughter. It was a kind of snarl, honest in a way his other noise had never been. He spurred for the gate. His men did not let him in quickly enough to please him. One dog got its teeth in his boot and dragged his foot half free of the stirrup. A squire grabbed the animal and was dragged for his pain. The gates creaked and crept. Ramsay slipped through on a surge of horses and dogs and men, and the gates slammed shut on a dog's hindquarters. The animal shrieked. For a heartbeat, there was a broad, simple lesson in the yard of Winterfell, scrawled in red and brown and white. Jon sat his horse very still. He could feel his men wanting to move. He felt it in bones more than hearing it in their low growls and breaths. "Hold," he said for the 10th time in as many days, and the word had become the name of what they were doing. Let him eat his own dinner. By evening the kennels had gone quiet. Men on the wall didn't lean forward anymore. They lay down and slept with their brows furrowed like scolded children. A lantern burned out and no one replaced it. There were places where light should have been and wasn't. On the dawn of the next day, the hunter's gate opened a hand's breadth, and a woman in a laundress's gray slipped out with a bundle at her breast that might have been a child and might have been mere hope wrapped in cloth. The archers on the Stark line didn't lift their bows. She stumbled across the snow and fell at the ditch, and a man went out and swept her up and brought her back. She had no words for a very long time. Then she said, "They are eating leather," and then began to say it again and again, the way people touch a bruise because they cannot stop. In the middle afternoon, the shout went up on the wall. It was not anger, it was awe. The small postern door by the old kitchens opened, and a man came out carrying his own banner folded around itself so it could not be seen from within. He turned to face the yard and lifted the folded cloth and let it fall. If there had been a wind, it would have caught. There was not. It sagged, and then the sigh went through the men on the wall. It was a wolf, black on white. Men moved, and then men ran. John did not call a charge. He did not call anything. He began to move forward at a measured walk that turned into an eager walk that a man would call a run if he were not paying attention to his feet. The Vale Knights moved like a river finding a breach in a bank. Tormund loosed a yell like joy and grief in one sound that had no words. One lumbered, his big feet sinking into the snow with a sound like drums. Winterfell's inner yard turned into a fist and then a mouth. The postern door stopped being a door and started being a hole in a thing that had pretended to be whole. Men pulled at the gap. Other men pushed. The door buckled. The wolf banner lifted by the laundress's brother began to flap as if in a wind that had only just now decided to arrive. They went through. It was not a glorious sort of fighting. It was narrow and hot in the cold, and steam rose off men like from horses. John fought the way a man splits firewood. Steady and careful so the log doesn't glance and take your shin. Ramsay's men were thin and angry, and their anger did not help them. Some threw down spear and shield and folded. Some did not. John moved through it with Ghost at his heels like a white rumor. The direwolf's fur was spiked with frozen slashes, and his eyes were horrible and beautiful. Ramsay was not in the yard. He was not at the kennels. He had gone to the hall. Of course he had gone to the hall. The heart of Winterfell had been a home before it was a stronghold. Ramsay wanted to show a man how he had bent a home to his shape. He stood at the top of the hall steps with a bow again, because he loved straight lines you could draw through a man and into a wall. His first arrow missed John by an inch and quivered in the doorpost. His second took a man from the Vale in the thigh. The third flew wild. Perhaps Ramsay's hands were shaking from hunger or from rage. John climbed the steps with his shield forward. He did not bull up them. He climbed with the unhurried certainty of a man climbing back into his own bed. Ramsay smiled with his mouth and not at all with his eyes. "Would you rather your sister see you die here or in some bare yard where no one remembers your name?" he asked, voice silk scraped over stone. John lifted his shield and felt the thud of a fourth arrow. He took the last 2 steps in 2 lunges and knocked the bow aside with the shield rim. He put his fist in Ramsay's mouth and felt the satisfying crunch of teeth beneath skin. He hit him again because there was nothing else in the world just then that had a clearer logic, and then a third time because he had 3 brothers dead and a father and the math was wrong. Somewhere in the doing of it, he realized he was using Ramsay's own sword belt to hold him by the throat. He stopped on the breath between one blow and the next. The word that rose in him then was not hold. It was Sansa. He could not quite choose between T. Hem, so he let them be the same word and stepped back. "Bind him," he said, voice thick. Men came and tied Ramsay's hands and dragged him down the steps. He kicked and laughed with blood in his mouth, and it made him sound like a little boy pretending to be mean. Sansa stood in the yard below, her white cloak dark with spatters where the snow had thrown it back at her. She had not covered her hair, and it was a bright distress in a world of white and gray. She looked up at the man they brought down as if from very far away. It is hard to watch someone who has taught you a language of fear speak in another tongue. Ramsay smiled for her as if for a lover. "My lady wife," he said, lips red. "I meant to give you a present later. I find I cannot keep gifts as well as I used to." She did not answer. She turned and walked toward the kennels. For a heartbeat John thought she was going to leave him there under the open sky. But she only moved to another place where the sky was cut into neat squares by slats of wood. The kennel stank of straw and shit and old meat and the faint, sour smell of hunger made into air. The dogs did not bark now. They stood with their heads up and their ears sweetly cocked, reading the room. Sansa stood at the door and did not go in. She turned her face, and now she looked at Ramsay. "You said your hounds would never harm you," she said. "You said you'd starve them 7 days and they'd still lick your hand." Ramsay's laugh slipped out, weightless and ragged. "They know their master." "They do," she said. "So do we all now." She did not look at Jon. She did not ask him to leave or to turn his head. She nodded to the men who held Ramsay, and they dragged him into the kennel. She did not watch the beginning. She did not watch the end. She stepped away, a half step, and looked not at the dogs or at Ramsay but at the space above his head. At a point on a wall that had seen her as a child and seen her learning to wear her hair like a lady and seen her carry a tray in her own house while a man she did not choose told her what her choice had been. Jon stood in the doorway of the kennel as long as it took to be sure it was done. He did not watch all of it either. Some acts are not improved by being observed. He stood until the silence filled the room like a tide coming in. Then he turned and went out into the yard and found the air. It was very quiet for a moment. Then the sound rose, not like a cheer but like a long breath released from many chests at once. Men lowered their swords and suddenly looked very young. One sat down heavily and put his great hands on his knees and closed his eyes like a tired child. Ghost went to him and put his head against the giant's thigh. Tormund leaned his axe against his shoulder and wiped his face with both hands and laughed his big, surprised laugh. Davos took a small wooden horse from inside his coat and turned it over and over in his hands until the edges could have cut him. He looked around until he found Melisandre at the edge of the yard. They did not speak. Words could not fit into what sat between them. She inclined her head, a fraction, and stepped back into the crowd as if the air itself accepted her vanishing. They cut down the flayed man from Winterfell's gate and burned him without ceremony. Sansa walked with Jon into the great hall. The old banners came down and the old banners went up again, and the wolf snapped in the new draft. It was not joy that swelled the room. It was something quieter and more enduring. The feeling of a house that has been ill and finds its fever gone. Women went to the kitchens and scolded the ovens and wept when bread came out. Men went to the armory and touched old swords as if old friends had come back from far-shadowed roads. They found too much to count that needed mending. The hot springs ran warm but the conduits needed scraping. The outer wall had a place where a giant vine had pushed out mortar. The old wood of the weirwood was black at the edges of the leaves, as it gets in deep winter, and someone would need to sweep the snow from its roots and whisper to it so the old gods would not feel neglected. Sansa took a ledger and a quill and began to write names. Jon walked the halls and felt the stones like bones under skin. Late in the day, when the red light slid along the floor and made the rushes glow, the great hall filled. Men and women came with small voices at first, and then louder ones. They said the things men say when they have survived. They told jokes that had been waiting in their mouths since fear had made them unfunny, and they stood in small groups and leaned shoulders. Someone began to sing, not a brave song but a kitchen song about ale gone sour and a dog who learned to drink it. Others answered with the song that always follows it, the one about a girl who goes down to the river to wash clothes and comes up with a husband and 3 fish. Even the Vale Knights smiled when they understood the rude bits. Jon stood at the front and watched. He did not stand on the dais at first. He did not like height. He liked the press of bodies and the warmth of breath and the ordinary smell of spiced carrot soup and wet wool. Sansa came to him and touched his sleeve lightly. "They need to see someone on the high seat," she said. "They'll not sit down in their own house until someone sits up there." He went up. Felt wrong and it felt right. He felt the eyes of 1,000 years looking over his shoulder. Men with wolf heads, women with knives at their belts, children who had run the walls and learned the names of the stones. He sat and thought, "I'm only holding this for the dead until the living come to claim it." Then he thought, "The living are here and they are asking me to hold it." Lyanna Mormont spoke because of course she did. She came forward as a spear comes down a line, and Jon almost smiled because she still had to rise on her toes to be seen over the shoulder of the man in front of her. "My Uncle Yora said men could be brave and foolish at once," she said. "He proved it and then left, and now he's doing penance by the shape of it. This man, She pointed at Jon as if accusing him of a theft. "Is brave. He is not foolish. He did not run like a dog when his brother fell. He did not go up against a wall as if walls were meat. He held. He held until the bad meat rotted and fell off. He held for the North. My house remembers that we swore to House Stark. We remember it now." A murmur rose and changed shape. A tall, spare man in a patched cloak lifted his voice. A Glover, grim and exact. "We know kings come cheap and go dear," he said. "We've had them to the left and the right. We've had them in the south and on the sea. The one we need now wears wolf's blood and knows hunger. The one we need knows the crows and the wild men and the small folk who cook our soup. He's a bastard, and that's a word that men like to use like a hammer on a nail. He's our bastard. King in the North," someone shouted, because there is always someone. It sounded silly at first because it was too large a garment to fit easily in the mouth. Then more men said it, and the edges of the words wore down, and it became something you might put on a man without hurting him. King in the North. Jon felt the sound lay itself like a mantle across his shoulders. He met Sansa's eyes, and there was a flicker there like the blink of sunlight on ice. Not joy, not envy, something harder to name. He thought of the letter she had written and the raven's black wing on a moon that looked like a knife. He thought of all the things he could not have done without her. He stood slowly. "I am Jon Snow," he said, and the hall quieted because he did not shout. "I have been a builder when the wall needed stone, and a crow when it needed men to walk the top of it, and a corpse when it needed someone to teach it that the dead don't sleep as they should. I will be what the North needs. Not with songs, not with titles." He looked around the room. His eyes found Davos leaning in a shadow, Melisandre at the back like a coal in a drift, Tormund with his red beard bright as a spill of blood in a pail of milk, Brienne still as a statue meant to hold up a roof. "We are not done," he said. "The winter is not done with us. The dead are not done with us." There was a stir at that. Men wanted to forget the dead. They wanted to use the word only for themselves when their old had gone and their young had not come back from the field. But the North, if it is anything, is honest. People know where the wind comes from. They looked down and up and across and then nodded as if answering a schoolmaster. Jon's eyes found Melisandre again and then sought Davos. The old knight came forward and opened his hand, revealing the small blackened horse. He held it out, not to Jon but to the space between them, as if making an offering to a god that might accept it or not. Then he turned his head toward the Red Woman and said, very simply, "I know what you did." The hall shifted. Men sensed something coiling. Melisandre did not attempt to smile. "I did what I believed," she said softly, and the softness made it crueler. "I believed wrong." "Wrong does not warm a child in a snowstorm," Davos said. His voice did not rise. There was iron in it, but it was the iron of a pot on a hearth, not a sword in a hand. "There's justice, Lord," he said to Jon, turning his head. "I know your two men inside. One who wants to cut her head off and one who wants to use what she knows when the wind comes full of ghosts. You can be both. You can make a narrow path between if you're smarter than I am." Jon could feel everyone's eyes. He saw a future where he slew her and felt the hot satisfaction of a straight line drawn through a wrong and into an answer. He saw a future where he let her stay and saw the disgust in the faces of men who had not liked her even when she raised him from death like a badly mended shirt. "You will leave the North," he said at last, turning to Melisandre. "Today. You will go south or east or wherever a road takes you. If you ever return, I will have you executed for murder." He looked at Davos. "It is not enough, I know. It is the path I have." Davos's face did a small thing that was not quite a smile and not quite a grimace. "It's a path," he said. "We're men with boots. We take paths." Melisandre inclined her head. "I saw you in the flames," she told Jon quietly, the last cruelty of truth. "I thought I saw a king. Perhaps I saw only a man with snow on his shoulders. That is enough." She turned and the hall parted for her like a wave. When she was gone, there was a sense of the room being larger, as if a candle had been snuffed. People breathe differently when a hot coal is taken out from under their beds. Davos closed his hand around the wooden horse again and went back to the shadow and stood the way old men stand. Ready to sit if someone gives them the chance, and just as ready to stand until the task is done. That night the aurora snaked, green and cold, over the far north. Men went out into the yard and tilted their heads and watched the sky like a creature. Sansa and Jon stood shoulder to shoulder where the snow piled against the low wall by the kitchen. Steam rose from the baths and made the stars look soft at their edges. "I cannot give you Rickon," Jon said, and the sentence was like a shard in his mouth. "No," Sansa said. She did not cry. "You gave me something else. Time. I used it." "So did you. That is what women make when men fight. Time." He looked at her and tried to imagine, and could not, the shape of the thing she had been made into by other people's making. She looked back at him and saw in him the shape of a man who had let the world kill him and then tell him to keep walking. "Littlefinger will collect," she said after a while, almost conversational. "He collects whether he lends or not. That's the trick of his kind of counting." "I know," Jon said. It was true. He had looked into Baelish's eyes as the man had thanked him for taking the Vale's knights into his order, and had seen there the gleam that is not warmth but the reflection of coins. He had seen, too, something he could not quite get his hand around. A hunger not for bread or meat or the warmth of a dog but for a story that ended with the teller at the top of the tall pile of words. "I won't be traded," Sansa said softly. "Not for a house, not for a castle, not for warm weather or the promise of a bed with silk. I won't be a margin in his book." "You won't," Jon said. He was not sure whether promises made in the dark are less real or more. He made this one anyway. Winterfell learned to breathe again. The kitchens took the shape of a song sung properly and the cellars filled with the order of lists. Parching wheat went to the grindstone and bread came out and into children's hands. Men who had run went home to their holes and learned to look at their wives' faces as if seeing them for the first time after a long absence. The ravens went out every morning like black leaves torn from a tree, carrying news to a north that wanted it hungrily. The snow did not stop. It came down slow, penitential, like something that had been told to cover the muck of men's days. The dead did not move, not yet. Jon walked the wall of Winterfell and put a hand on stone that had warmed his childhood and now warmed his promise. He felt less like a king than like a hinge. Things moved around him. He tried to make sure they did not swing too far or too fast. He went to the gods wood often and stood and looked up at the face carved into the old weirwood and tried to talk without words. Tormund taught the boys from the Vale how to keep a watch in a whiteout by tasting the air. If it smells like nothing and you're nervous, that's good. Brienne taught a dozen girls how to hold a shield so it didn't tear their shoulders out. Davos taught anyone who came by how to make a pot of soup feed twice as many with the same amount of food, which was a magic better than prayers. Lyanna Mormont wrote 3 letters a day, and each of them obliged a neighbor to look at their own ledger and remember they owed a debt. Ghost found a place by the hearth under the high table and took to sleeping with his head on an unstrung bough as if waiting for the string. One morning, just after the first light had turned the snow to a faint sheen, Jon went down to the crypts. He did not take a torch. He knew the way by hand and by memory. The stone wolves stood in their places over the kneeling figures of his dead. He went to Lyanna's statue and stood there until he could hear his own breath again and until the hard cold bit his fingertips into feeling. He laid his palm on the stone and it felt like a forehead. "We are home," he said quietly, though he knew the dead didn't deserve lies. He let the words carry the truth. "We are home in a house that we have made over out of hunger and waiting. We are home and the winter is still long. We are home and we will leave again because that is what men do." When he came up, the light had strengthened to a gray that promised a day like the one before and the one before that. Sansa waited for him at the top of the steps with a cup of hot barley water. He took it and wrapped his hands around it, and the heat pushed into his bones like a blessing his old gods would not say but could suggest. They walked side by side out into the yard. It was full of the dull and honorable noises of work. "Message from White Harbor," she said, passing him a folded and ribboned strip of parchment. "Lord Manderly gives you comforts and warnings in equal measure, as is his habit. John opened it and read and felt the shape of the north beyond Winterfell move under his feet. A deep thing and an old thing, not unlike the river that sometimes runs far under the ground and comes up in a pool you'd swear had no source. Ships from the south. Rumors of lions hungry in winter, and the cold lions in their cleft rock. Rumors of something else, too, of dead men on the shore with eyes like river ice, and a fisherman who had struck one with an oar and broken the oar and not the man. John looked up, eyes going north as if his skull held a magnet. "Soon," he murmured. "Soon." Sansa followed his gaze and saw nothing. The yard, the kitchen, the old well. She laid a hand on his arm without looking at him, the gesture of someone who has learned to do without looking, so she will not be shy of asking. "We waited and won a house back," she said. "We can wait and win a world, but one thing at a time. Eat, sleep, let the snow do part of your work." He smiled then, the hard thing in his face softening for a breath. Aye, there was work to do. There would always be work to do. Stitches to set and lines to draw and men to feed and roads to clear and dead to honor. The siege had not made them clever. It had made them patient. Patience had made them victorious. Victory had made them not safe but ready. Winterfell breathed on the cold air like a living thing. The ravens lifted from the rookery in a black puff and blew apart into dots that became letters in other men's rooms. The snow came clean and slow. Somewhere out on the white plain a red flower would bloom for a day against all reason, because even in winter there are little defiances. In the halls, fires burned and a boy who had not known hunger before these days took a second piece of bread and then set it back because he had learned something about other mouths. In the courtyard, Ghost blinked and yawned and put his muzzle between his paws and watched as the gate swung open and a group of children ran out to make angels in the snow. John stood on the wall and looked north. He would go there soon. He would take men and warnings and hope. He felt Sansa step up beside him, her shoulder a familiar weight. "We have time," she said. He did not say that time was another word for winter when you counted it right. He only nodded. He looked down at Winterfell, at the yard and the hall and the windows that gleamed. He looked up at the sky that held wrens and vultures in the same blue. He had learned a new kind of fighting. He had learned how to hold. He would teach it to the north. He would teach it to himself again and again. He would hold the wall. He would hold the line. He would hold his sister's promise in his pocket like a coin he would not spend. The wind pulled at his cloak and found him steady. He breathed, and the breath plumed and was gone, and he took another. It was like that. It would be like that for a long time. He put his hand on the stone of Winterfell, and it was warm. He did not say any prayer. He did not need to. The stone understood. The snow understood. The north listened and remembered and waited with him, hungry for whatever came next and content to stand a while longer under the gray winter sky.